Hi everyone. This is an overview of books 1 and 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. I'm just going to be covering the highlights here, and the version on this webpage actually only includes excerpts from books 1 and 2. As you can see, it drops us in on section 7 or part 7 of book 1. So this is halfway through book 1, so what has Aristotle been doing for the first half of the book? Let me just cover that briefly. What he's done so far in book 1 is to identify the chief good for human beings. The chief good is the ultimate good or the highest good of a human life, and he calls that happiness. Now, what he has in mind here for happiness isn't just pleasure or good feelings. The Greek word for happiness here is eudaimonia, which means flourishing. So, human flourishing. So what he thinks is that the goal of human life is to flourish, but that's still quite vague. So in this section, he's going to try to fill that out and give us more details. So here we are in part 7. He says, quote, "Presumably, however, to say that happiness is the chief good seems a platitude, and a clearer account of what it is still desired. This might perhaps be given if we could first ascertain the function of man. For just as for a flute player, a sculptor, or an artist, and in general for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function. So would it seem to be for man, if he has a function. Have the carpenter then and the tanner certain functions or activities, and has man none? Is he born without a function, or as eye, hand, foot, and in general each of the parts evidently has a function, may one lay it down that man similarly has a function apart from all these? What then can this be?" So this is sometimes called the function argument. Here he's trying to identify what the function of a human being or a human life is, and that way he can identify what it means to live a good life and to do the right kind of thing. So he considers several candidates here. He considers life in general. Is it the purpose or function of human life to just live and survive? But he says that that's something that we have in common with plants, so that's not a type of happiness that's unique or peculiar to human beings. Then he considers the life of perception, but he says this is something we have in common with animals, and so this is not living a life of perception isn't what it means to live a happy life. And so he concludes that it's got to have something to do with activity, and activity in accord with this rational element in us, something that sets us apart from the rest of nature. So he concludes this section, he says, human good turns out to be activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. So virtue here he's defining as a human excellence, and by that he means something having to do with activity in accord with reason. Okay, moving on to part 8 here. We must consider it, however, in the light not only of our conclusion and our premises, but also of what is commonly said about it. So he wants his account of human happiness or human virtue to square with what is commonly said about it among other people and philosophers. So first he considers that lots of people think that virtue has to be about action. And he says that it makes no sense for someone to be virtuous if they don't act. They can't just be someone who's good. They've got to actually do something good. So that's what this section's about. He also considers that a virtuous life must be pleasant. Now earlier on in book 1, he dismissed the idea of pleasure as the goal for human life. But here he's saying that the result of living a virtuous life should be pleasant. It shouldn't be unpleasant. Naturally, we would think we would enjoy it if it's what we were, if it was part of our function, living a virtuous life. So, and then finally, he wraps up this section with the discussion of external goods. Now, elsewhere, he has thought that one's circumstances shouldn't affect one's happiness. But he does admit here that there are some external goods like wealth, power, friends, and other things that seem necessary if we're going to say that a particular life is a good one or a happy one. Okay, moving on now to book 2. he's going to now explore in more detail what it means to be virtuous. At the end of book 1, it was skipped on this webpage, but on the end of book 1, Aristotle identifies happiness with an activity of the soul in accordance with perfect virtue. And he talks about two kinds of virtue, intellectual and moral. But what he's going to say here at the beginning of book 2 is that a virtue is something that is a habit. It's not something that we just get by nature or we just are endowed with it. It's something that we've got to learn. Beginning at the end of this first paragraph, he says, "Neither by nature then, nor contrary to nature, do the virtues arise in us. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them and are made perfect by habit." So how do we become habituated and become more virtuous? Well, he says, by doing, by practicing. He says, quote, "For the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. For example, men become builders by building, and lyre players by playing the lyre. So too, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, and brave by doing brave acts." So if you recognize that you yourself don't have virtue or complete virtue, no problem. Just practice, 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 and eventually you will become more virtuous. Skipping down to part 2 in book 2, he says that it is the nature of such things to be destroyed by defect and excess. So this here is the so-called doctrine of the mean. So what does it mean to have virtue? For him, it means to avoid defect and excess. He says, "For the man who flies from and fears everything and does not stand his ground against anything becomes a coward. And the man who fears nothing at all but goes to meet every danger becomes rash." So here again we have defect or deficit and excess. Cowardice is the defect or deficit, and rashness in this case is the excess. So somewhere in the middle, we call it the mean here, the doctrine of the mean. Somewhere in the middle is the virtue. So in the next section, he says, "Virtue must have the quality of aiming at the intermediate, or the middle. I mean moral virtue, for it is this that is concerned with passions and actions, and in these there is excess, defect, and the intermediate. For instance, both fear and confidence, and appetite and anger and pity, and in general pleasure and pain may be felt both too much and too little, and in both cases not well. But to feel them at the right times, with reference to the right objects, toward the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way, is what is both intermediate and best, and this is characteristic of virtue." Similarly, with regard to actions, also there is excess, defect, and the intermediate. So basically, his doctrine of the mean, or the doctrine of virtue, is that the good life is found in the middle, not too far on this side, not too far on the other side. It's found in the middle, and it's got to be just right. He says, "Virtue then is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean." In other words, a mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Now it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect. So this is not relativistic, but there is a sense of situationalism here, meaning that one's situation matters or one's circumstances matter. So if you want to determine what it is to do the right thing, you've got to understand all the factors of your situation to really know what it is to choose the right thing, or to choose the mean, as he describes it, the mean relative to us. So for me, in my circumstances, the right thing might be different than what it is for you in similar circumstances, just because of what I bring to the table, what you bring to the table. So it all depends here on this rational principle. And he says it's determined by this man of practical wisdom. So really, it's the practical wisdom, the man of practical wisdom being in your shoes, in your situation, which would determine what is the right thing to do. That's basically virtue ethics. He continues, but not every action nor every passion admits of a mean. For some have names that already imply badness. For example, spite, shamelessness, envy, and then he continues, adultery, theft, and murder. Basically what he's saying here is that not everything in life is the intermediate. There are some things that are just plain wrong. You should never do them. You're not supposed to do them in moderation, like adultery, theft, and murder. So his principle doesn't apply to everything, he says, but it applies to these virtues. And if we stick to the virtues and we try to cultivate these virtues in our life, we will do the right thing and we will live a good life. All right, I hope you found that helpful.